let me just start out by saying migration is as old as human history, even before we get to written history. If you have archaeologists digging in places, they can affirm that people have always been on the move. Right? So migration is in fact of life, it's always been around. And to put this in global context, worldwide we have about 200 million people who work in a country outside of their country of birth. Right? So this is a global problem. The US is not the only country that has problems with migration or immigration, and if you've been following the Syrian migrant crisis in Europe, you'll have a sense that it's a lot worse there. Right? But obviously we do have a lot of people trying to come here to the United States. To move on with stats, we have about 40 million immigrants here in the United States. That means it's about 12% of the population. Of those 40 million, ballpark, half are naturalized citizens, and about a quarter are green card holders, and about a quarter are undocumented. We don't like to use the word illegal because it conjures up all kinds of problems, and unlawful entry is actually a civil matter, and it does not fall under the category of criminal law. But so we have about, figures vary. Sometimes people say 11 million, sometimes 12 million undocumented persons. But to put this in a different context, about 5 million children in the United States, these are U.S. citizen children, have at least one undocumented parent. Right? So for those of you going out looking to become teachers, you need to be aware of this. Right? So nationally, the rate of immigrants to the general population is about 12%. In New York State, it's about 22%. Right? So almost 1 out of every 4 people, 1 out of 5 living in New York State are not born here in the United States. Again, that does not mean that everybody is undocumented, right? It just means that they're foreign born, including myself. And may I add, I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen. But actually one reason why I did become a naturalized U.S. citizen is because I was terrified of getting deported, even though I had papers, terrified of getting deported and getting separated from my kids. So in this country you can get deported for the silliest reasons. Right, and sometimes for reasons that are beyond your control. To put this in a different set of statistics, 1 out of 5 families in this country are of mixed status. And what I mean by that is that some family members are U.S. citizens and some are not. Some of those family members might be green card holders. I'm not saying just because they're not U.S. citizens that automatically they do not have papers, right? So please keep that in mind. But what we're looking at is a significant percentage of the population. And one of the challenges, obviously, for this country and other countries as well, is how do we get a handle on this and what's a reasonable approach? One thing we absolutely cannot afford to do is to stick our head in the sand. Right? If we stick our heads in the sand, this problem is not going to go away. And guess what? Even if we deport millions of people, this problem is not going to go away, because ultimately one of the main reasons why people migrate has to do with economic forces. So we cannot build a wall high enough. It's just unrealistic to think that we can just deport everybody. So the solution has to be a sensible solution, right? Something that makes sense, something that is just, something that is fair. And of course that means that it's also fair for U.S. citizens, I understand that. But it also has to be just, and it has to comply with international law. And while it is true that countries can determine who comes into the country and who does not, we have control of our borders. Nonetheless, we have to comply with international human rights law in this process. So far, already 2 million people have been deported under the Obama administration alone. And that has not significantly altered the number of people who are in this country. And again, a lot of it has to do with economics. For example, if somebody can make 10 times the hourly rate here in the United States than they can in Mexico, then the pull factor is just too strong. So in terms of reasons, definitely economic reasons. are very important. And if we're just looking at Mexico alone, we should understand the impact of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, for example, which pushed over 1 million Mexican farmers off the land, who then ended up, I mean, where do you go, right? You go where you think the jobs are, and they ended up coming north. But that was a problem that was created by this free trade agreement, right? And so sometimes it can be attributed to very specific economic factors. Again, if you have such a great wage differential, you know, if it's 10 to 1, yes, people are going to come. I've heard some statistics that say once the wage differential gets to 4 to 1, then people no longer take the risk, right? Of course, a huge problem is also political, and under this category of political, I have included wars, right? Wars, civil wars. Again, think of Syria, right? People are leaving Syria not because they think it's going to be so much fun to arrive in Europe, but simply because their lives are at risk and they cannot stay where they are. So people are quite desperate. And people coming up from Central America or from Mexico, but oftentimes they come from further south and then travel through Mexico. These are people who are really very desperate and take tremendous risks traveling up here. Young women, and that includes teenagers, who embark on this journey to take the train across Mexico to come up here, are basically advised to get on birth control pills because chances are so high that they will get raped, and at least, you know, that they're not going to get pregnant as a result of those rapes. A lot of people get killed. One of the statistics I heard, this is the first 6 months in 2010, over 11,000 people were kidnapped just trying to cross Mexico. Right? So it creates a huge humanitarian problem. Okay, as far as what goes on over here, a lot of people are saying, why don't these people go back home? Well, again, oftentimes they cannot go home. But one way to sort of look at this problem in terms of what could the U.S. Congress do, a very, very easy solution would be to just raise the visa caps. We have not adjusted our visa cap since the 1960s. We now have a world population that is almost double of what it was back then. And again, if you think of 200 million people working outside the country they were born, right, it's just silly to imagine that visa caps from the 1960s are going to be adequate, right? So right now, you know, we give visas for ballpark 1 million people, but 2 million people try to come in. Because we have visas that are allotted per country. That means countries like Mexico or China or India basically use up their visas that are allotted per year very, very quickly. So you may, let's say if you're in Mexico, let's say you're trying to do the right thing, let's say you're visiting your embassy, you're going through all the paperwork, let's say your visa has been granted, let's say you have relatives over here, you've gotten a visa. It may be granted, it's not going to be issued because of the visa backlog. Right now, if you are Mexican and you try to do the right thing, the backlog is 20 years. Okay. Now imagine if you have kids, right, in another country, somebody's going to suggest, come back in 20 years. Well, I'm sorry, right? How are you going to raise those kids? That is not workable. So a lot of people who break the law to come up here do so simply because legal avenues have been closed to them, right? And that's something that Congress could fix very, very easily, right? Stroke of a pen, in fact, could take care of this, could take care of the visa cap situation. Congress has, for many decades now, failed to enact comprehensive immigration reform. Everybody agrees the system is broken, right? But you get gridlock in Congress, and that's, again, why we have so many problems here. If there were bipartisan leadership, again, thinking of solutions that are just and fair, to everybody, right? We could come up with some solutions, but Congress has failed. And it's in this absence of comprehensive immigration reform that administrations for some time have been totally focused on enforcement alone. So you get this emphasis on deportation, right? We're going to deport as many people as possible. On any given day, 34,000 people are in immigrant detention, right? We're deporting about 400,000 people every single year. And like I said, under Obama administration alone, we have deported 2 million people, right? Deportation is not going to solve the problem because it's structural, right? And it's not the fault of individual people, right? So we have to look for a structural solution to all of this. To make a long story short, a lot of people are anti-immigrant because they are afraid. They're worried about their own job security and that of their children. Sometimes that fear can very easily be manipulated into anger and hatred, right? So depending on what district you're in, somebody in Congress may say, well, you know, I'm not going to vote for comprehensive immigration reform. I may not get reelected, right? But a lot of constituents who have anti-immigrant attitudes really base that on either, yeah, right, on erroneous facts, right? So they don't have the facts. So for example, a lot of people claim that immigrants are criminals. Statistics, and that includes statistics compiled by the FBI, have demonstrated over and over again that communities that have a high percentage of immigrant populations have in fact lower crime rates. Why? If you're an immigrant, especially if you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't want to get entangled with the law, right? You want to keep a low profile, you want to do everything you can to stay within the bounds of the law. So this notion that people come up here to be criminals, statistically, it does not bear out. The other fear that people have is that immigrants come up here to steal jobs. Let me just suggest to you that not very many of us would be willing or even able to milk a cow. You know, if you're not used to being on a farm, farm work is not going to be for you. I know my kids are not going to be milking cows, right? So somebody who comes up here to milk a cow is not going to take a job from my kid. Right? I mean, that's just the reality of it, right? It depends on what industry you're looking at. So, for example, if it's housing construction, yes, you know, migrant worker may outbid a U.S. worker. So, you know, it all depends on what industry you're looking at. But labor has been joining groups that have pushed for comprehensive immigration reform because labor has recognized that the only way to protect U.S. labor is to protect all labor, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the solutions would be have laws on, you know, on the books and allow people to come out of the shadows, right? Allowing people to come out of the shadows, to register with the government so that we actually know who's here, right? Wouldn't it be nice to actually know who's here? And then if everybody could have labor protections, people here might not feel so insecure about their own jobs. Solutions. Raising the visa cap, like I said, that could be very easily done. Protecting all labor in the U.S., I think that would be a worthwhile goal. And here's another idea, right? If we are so concerned about, let's say, for example, people coming up from Guatemala, we could invest, we as a country could invest, and it would take only a fraction of the money that we currently spend on enforcement so that Guatemalans can stay in Guatemala, for example, right? A lot of what went on in Guatemala, so Guatemala was not affected by NAFTA, but we've had some nasty civil wars that the U.S. was involved in. Sometimes the U.S. has destabilized governments, has toppled governments, and in that context of civil wars, then a lot of people have fled, right? So if we look at this problem, you know, from a larger perspective, demonizing individual migrants is not going to do the trick. Demonizing individual people is not going to solve the problem. But if we're looking for a structural solution, we also have to look at the involvement of the U.S. in foreign policy, and we have to be able to sort of think along the lines of what can we do to make it possible for people to stay where they are. And that would go a long way toward the solution. And also, let me just say again, I've said it already, that even though the U.S. has the right to control its own borders, the U.S. still has to follow international human rights norms to do that. So, for example, if we have asylum seekers coming in this country, we cannot just kick them out. We actually have to process them to determine whether or not they have a legitimate claim, right? So, you know, that's just one example. What we've had so far is a lot of emphasis on enforcement. We have a couple of programs. Among them are the CAP, Criminal Alien Program. We have ESCOM, Secure Communities. We have 287G. to make a long story short, what all of those programs have done is try to get local police to do the jobs of federal immigration agents, right? Now, there's been a community response to that. And I'll give you guys an exercise, but you may want to think about it after you leave. Okay? Close your eyes and think of moments where you felt really safe, right? Was it in your bed at home? Was it playing in your backyard? Was it being with friends? What made you feel really safe, right? And I bet you did not envision a police car, right? So for a lot of immigrants who are already afraid that if they talk to the police that they might get deported, they are not likely to report if they witness a crime. They are not likely to report if they are a victim of crime. So for a lot of police departments around the country, what this has meant is if we're really concerned about community safety, and again, this is sheriffs, police chiefs. If we're concerned about community safety, we have to have a good relationship between police and the community. That means we have to establish a sense of trust, right? And a lot of these enforcement programs have eroded that trust. So what has happened on the level of communities, many cities have basically said, you know what, we're only going to go after people if they really are criminals, if the only thing they've done wrong is enter the country, right? If they're not going around, killing people, beating up people, stealing, robbing, we're just going to leave them alone. We're not going to ask people about their immigration status. Those policies, which from the perspective of police chiefs is designed to create greater safety for all of us, right? Those policies have been duped sanctuary cities. And so one of the things that people in Congress, that includes Senator Vitter from Louisiana, have done is to propose legislation that would basically punish these so-called sanctuary cities, okay? And what that would mean would be a massive budget cut. Now, this Vitter bill, also known as the Trump bill, because it's based on a lot of this hate rhetoric that's been flying around, was just voted down on cloture. All of the people in favor of the bill were Republicans. All of the people opposed to the bill were Democrats, right? So it really has become amazingly polarized. But this is what's going on right now, right? So Congress has failed with comprehensive immigration reform, and DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, designed to let people who came here as kids with their parents, to give them a chance to go to school and to get a pathway to legal status. So that's like a very fast little backdrop.
One day workshop.
Yeah, I do. But
you do.
There.
It'd be a
Thank
really
you.
good idea.